Good Sabbath morning to you. Good Sabbath afternoon to you. We want to welcome you. Now that a few bodies have left, we have a little more air circulating around us. I mentioned the first service that we're in the pre-church war era. This is the time of the year when it's not quite hot enough that we begin those church wars, where we spend the church service and Sabbath school saying, open the windows, close the windows, turn on the air conditioning, turn off the air conditioning. It's too hot, it's too cold. No, it's too hot. No, it's too cold. We're in that nice zone right now where we can just enjoy. Although yesterday I was thinking about the air conditioning at my home. I was thinking maybe it's time. So I was just thinking we could start a new rule. If you doze off, we'll turn on the air conditioning. How would that work? Do want to welcome Pastor Ford. Thank you for being here. I've heard lots of good things about you from Pastor Robert. And you obviously prepared him well for here. So we love him. And if he says you're a good guy, we believe you're a good guy. So welcome and thank you for being here. And we prayed a lot for you. You know, you've been through some definite health challenges, and we're glad to see you. I don't know how you looked before, but you're looking good now. So that's good. I want to welcome my parents who are here visiting. So I had a humbling experience this morning. Actually, Sister Phipps, you were out there having a conversation with two young ladies about that situation when, you know, you get called, someone gets called your mother and they're your sister, that kind of a thing. So I had that this morning. I was over at Valley View for the service there. And afterwards I was shaking hands with some of the residents, and the one lady said, "Oh, do you remember back the days of Maritime Academy?" And I'm like, yeah, even though it's not really true. Anyways, the point is, she's like, yeah, we used to go to school back there. And I was thinking, dear lady, I am like half your age. I wasn't even born when you were going to school back there in Academy. But she's like, oh yeah, we used to go to school together. It's good to see you again. And I said, yeah, it's been a long time. So some days you're reminded that even if you think you're not too old, apparently you look that way. So anyways, that's how I'm going to look when I'm that age, not right now. Excuse me. All right, enough of that. Let's move on to greater things. So please don't do what happened to me in Saskatoon. Please don't ask if my mother is my sister. Please don't ask if my wife is my daughter. I've had all those things happen to me in my life. I was once visiting a man in the hospital. He almost died. He was at death's door. The man looked like death. He was probably 20, 30 years older than me. And I was visiting this man in the hospital, and the nurse comes in and says, "Oh, are you his brother?" And I thought, how bad do I look? Anyways. All right, when I attended seminary, which was a long time ago, there were classes at the beginning of the fall and winter and spring quarters that were called colloquiums. And you would take one of these short 3-day colloquiums before you would begin all your regular classes that would go throughout the whole quarter. Part of what made colloquiums really good classes to take, at least from a student's perspective, was that there were no assignments and there were no tests. That was a good class to take. 3 days and you're done. You simply had to show up, and at the end you had to hand in some notes giving evidence that you had actually taken some notes relevant to what they were talking about, and you got credit, 1 credit for a university course. The colloquiums were great. One of the colloquiums that I chose to take was called The Pastor's Spiritual Life. And the truth is, I don't remember anything really about the specifics of what was presented in that class, that colloquium. I'm sure I've got some notes on it stored away in a box somewhere, one of the many boxes I have not opened in years. I don't remember who the instructor was. I was trying to think about that. I think it might have been Dr. Kilcher, but it might not have been too. I really don't remember. But that colloquium does stand out in my memory more than any of the others I took. Actually, I don't remember any of the others I took. But that one stands out, I guess, mostly because of its location. The first day was in a classroom in the seminary building, like all of the other colloquiums, but the last 2 days we met at a house out in the country about a half-hour drive from the university. And this was one of those kind of old farm-style houses with a great big veranda in the front. There was a big tree out in the front lawn with one of those tree swings with big long ropes you could swing in, and there was a large pond with a rowboat that you could row out and sit in the middle of the pond. Very idyllic setting. And apparently a couple had set aside this house and property as a quiet retreat for pastors and seminary students and their families. And that meant that pastors were welcome to come and stay there for a few hours, a few days, for no charge, whatever they wanted. And if they wanted to, they could help out with some of the chores of keeping the house and the grounds in good shape. But it was just a beautiful place set aside as a retreat. And that colloquium provided us with a valuable opportunity to just spend some peaceful time with God. It was a very refreshing change from the hectic routine of school, always writing papers and and doing, assignments and all of that. It was nice just to be peaceful for a couple of days. And, Sandra and I several times would say during the time at our seminary, we should go back there. We should go back for a visit. We should go spend a few hours, spend a few days, or maybe not a few days, but a day. We were going to do that. School is busy, and life is busy, and work was busy, and before long it was time to graduate, and somehow the time came and the time left, and we never made it back. And so life rushes on. And so it has continued to rush on over the years, over the decades. Well, I would like for you today to open up your Bible or access your Bible if you've got one and find a passage of Scripture that tells about Paul taking some quiet time apart alone with God. And find it in Galatians chapter 1. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. The go eat popcorn of the Bible. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Galatians chapter 1, and I want us to start reading at verse 11. And find out about this place of refuge that Paul had. Galatians chapter 1, beginning at verse 11. Paul writes to them, "But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. So Paul here is giving a very brief summary of his life right after his conversion to Christianity. And I think it's very interesting what he says there in verse 17. Look at it again. He said, "Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus." So Paul notes that after becoming a Christian, he did not go to Jerusalem to see the apostles, but rather he went to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Well, so what's so interesting about that, Pastor? Glad you want to know. Yes. If Paul had not mentioned his time in Arabia here in this verse, you know what? We wouldn't even know about it. Because this is the only place where it's mentioned. It's mentioned nowhere else in the Bible. And I think these little things that are mentioned only once in the Bible are kind of interesting, kind of intriguing. So to get a more complete picture, we have to piece together this information that we have here in Galatians with the rest of the biblical story that we have of Paul's early years as a Christian. And we can find that in Acts chapter 9, which tells of the amazing story of how Paul was headed for the city of Damascus He was planning to round up as many Christians as he could find. He was going to bring them back to Jerusalem for trial. But shortly before arriving at Damascus, his plans were changed. In fact, his whole life was changed when he experienced a dramatic and miraculous personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Paul was left temporarily blind from that meeting with the Lord, and so he was led into the city that he was heading to by the men who were traveling with him. And there God arranged for a Christian man named Ananias to restore Paul's sight, thank you, and baptize him as a new Christian believer. I'm going to put this over here, or it's guaranteed to be kicked. Thank you. So that's the brief outline of the story, and that brings us then to the section of Acts 9, which was read earlier by Norma in our scripture reading. So let's go back and look at that again as we put the story together. Go back to Acts chapter 9. I've briefly summarized where we're up to till we get to the point of verse 19. He's gone into the city, he's been baptized, he's received his sight, and then let's carry on from verse 19. Acts 9, verse 19. It says, "And when he had received food, he was strengthened. Then Saul spent some days with the disciples at Damascus. Immediately he preached the Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. Then all who heard were amazed and said, 'Is this not he who destroyed those who called on this name in Jerusalem, and has come here for that purpose, so that he might bring them bound to the chief priests?' But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, proving that this Jesus is the Christ." We're at the end of verse 22, and it's right here. In my Bible, there's conveniently even a space. It's right here between verses 22 and 23. That is where Paul's time in Arabia comes in. So if you're the type of person who likes to write in your Bible, you can. I'm getting lots of water, thank you. The challenge is if I drink the water, then it washes down the cough drops, so I'm not sure which is going to be most effective, but thank you, thank you. So if you like to write in your Bible, you can write right between 22 and 23. You could just write in there Galatians 1:17, because that's where the trip to Arabia comes in, right between those two verses in Acts 9. Galatians 1:17, Paul says that he went to Arabia and returned to Damascus. And after verse 1:17 of Galatians, you could read on, continue on in Acts chapter 9 with verse 23. Now that he's back from Arabia, he says, "Now," in verse 23, "after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket." And so the story continues. All right, so let's just briefly recap this a little bit. I don't know if you can see this map up here or see through my head. But there's Jerusalem. That's where he started off. He was going to make his way up here to Damascus, gather up a bunch of Christians, bring them back, and take care of them. But he got up here part way, he met the Lord, ended up becoming a Christian. And then what did he do? Did he go back to Jerusalem? No, he came way down here to Arabia, this big area down here of Arabia. And when he was done there, he went back to Damascus. And it was a bit later that he eventually went down to Jerusalem, and eventually later on in the story, he's up here where he was born. All right, just to sort of follow it along. So let's recap that. Paul is converted to Christianity on his way to Damascus. In Damascus, he is baptized. He joins the Christian church. He spends, it says, some days, or in other words, a relatively short period of time, there in that city of Damascus, preaching about Jesus in such a way that the Jews are baffled as to how to answer him. And then Paul goes down to Arabia for a while. We don't know exactly how much time it was. Later he returns to Damascus, and this time he stays for a longer period of time. This time those opposed to his preaching get to the point where they want to kill him, so he has to flee from the city, and it ends up being 3 years from when he first arrived in Damascus that he's forced to escape for his life, and he returns to Jerusalem. He planned just a quick trip to Damascus, gather the Christians, take them back. It turned out to be 3 years later. So recorded there in Galatians 1:17 is an important detail, I think, in the story of Paul's first few years as a Christian, and that is his time spent in Arabia. But we might ask the question, why was Paul, it's now some 20 years after his conversion, why is he going back now and reviewing all of these historical details of his life? Why is he doing that for the Galatian Christians? Well, it was the same old problem. It was the same old. The Judaizers had been at work among the Christians there in the Galatian churches. And these Judaizers, they believed and they taught that Gentiles had to first become Jews before they could really become Christians. They said, if you want to be a Christian, you've got to be a Jew first. According to them, salvation depended upon observing all of the Jewish customs and all of the ceremonial laws. But Paul taught the good news of the gospel. He taught that God's gift of salvation was freely offered to anyone who would accept it by faith. So they had a different opinion. So to sway the Christians to their beliefs, these Judaizers accused Paul of being a false apostle with no authority, and he also accused him of teaching a false gospel. And apparently they had convinced many of the Galatian Christians to at least have doubts now about Paul's teaching. So here in these first 2 chapters of Galatians, Paul, what he's doing is he's answering these accusations that have been made against him. He is showing them that he was indeed a true apostle who had been called and taught by Jesus Christ himself. And what he was saying to them is that is all the authority that he needed. It gave him the same authority and the same standing as the apostles who had been disciples of Jesus, who had been personally called by him, as we looked at in our Sabbath school lesson today. Paul makes it clear here that he did not learn the gospel that he taught from other men, but that he rather learned it directly by revelation from Jesus Christ. And so what he does is he goes over these details and includes one we didn't even have of his early years of ministry to prove that he had not, secretly by night slipped down to Jerusalem and had a crash course on gospel presentations so he could come back and say, yeah, I know about this now, and, learn it from the church leaders. He says no. And then he points out that when he did eventually go to Jerusalem, 3 years later, the apostles and the leaders were in complete agreement with his teaching, and they accepted him as a full-fledged fellow apostle. So of what significance is the fact that Paul left Damascus to go off to Arabia for a while? If Paul isn't going to say anything about what he did there, why even mention it? Why say, I went to Arabia and then I came back? Well, thanks, Paul. Give us a tantalizing little thought. And what did you go on vacation? Did you have to go buy a camel or something there? What did you need to do? What are you there for? Why? What happened in Arabia? Well, in verse 12 in Galatians 1, Paul stated that the gospel that he preached had come to him through the revelation of Jesus Christ. So when he mentions right after that going off to Arabia, while he doesn't state it specifically, he seems to be very clearly implying that it was there that he was taught by God. It was there that he came to a full understanding of his Christian beliefs. He learned basic Christianity there in Damascus, but it seems like it's when he went down to Arabia that he really got the full comprehensive understanding. There's no way for us to know where in Arabia he went. It's a fairly general name for a very large area. And while there were certainly many people who lived in Arabia, it was also a place made up of a lot of desert, a lot of wilderness, a lot of open spaces. And so it would seem that Paul's time in Arabia was mostly a more quiet, personal time of contemplation and communion with God. You know what's interesting? We have no record of Paul preaching any sermons in Arabia. We have no record of him teaching at all. We have no record of him raising up any churches. Does this sound like Paul? Can you imagine him? Not preaching, not teaching, there's no church in Arabia, dedicated to Paul, who brought us the gospel message. There's no record of anything like that. It's kind of interesting. It seems that Paul spent his time there more in solitude. And that's probably why Luke doesn't mention this retreat to Arabia in the book of Acts, because the book of Acts is focused on the events that were involved in the direct spread of the gospel message. So you can see why it wouldn't be part of the account that Luke gave. Luke must have known about it. He knew Paul well, but he didn't mention it. It seems that Paul needed this time apart to pray and to review the scriptures in the light of this new faith that he had in Jesus. Think about him. I mean, what a life change. He had to sort out a whole new outlook on life. He had to set aside many of his former convictions and prejudices, and that doesn't just happen in a second. He needed some time to sift through it all. He needed this quiet time alone with God to be able to really understand what was God's will. It was an important time, I think, of preparation for the challenging mission and ministry to which the Lord was going to call him. In 2 Corinthians 12:7, Paul mentions the abundance of the revelations that he had received. In Acts 26:16, the words of Jesus are recorded as he spoke to Paul at the time of his conversion on the road to Damascus. And there Jesus refers to the things which I will yet reveal to you. A good portion of these revelations to Paul must have occurred during his time in Arabia, thus giving him a solid foundation on which to build his ministry. I mean, think about Paul. He was about to become the writer of nearly a third of the New Testament. This is a person who you want to know what he's talking about. This is someone who needed that time of instruction from God. It was extremely important so that he could be very clear on what he was teaching and how he was leading. And Paul's time apart in the solitude of Arabia perhaps reminds us of some other great men in the Bible who also withdrew to more remote places of seclusion in preparation for ministry and mission and service to God. Think about Moses, right? 40 years tending the flocks out in the deserts of Midian. You can read about that in Exodus 2 and 3. 40 years before he led the Hebrew people out of Egypt to the promised land. Think about John the Baptist. Out there in the wilderness or deserts of Judea, it was there that God called him to his special prophetic role to prepare the way for the Messiah. Read about that in Luke 1 and Luke 3. And then, of course, we have the record of Jesus himself, spending 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his public ministry, Luke 4. As well, there are such a number of verses in the gospel accounts which refer to Jesus going off to a solitary place, going off into a mountain to pray. You find it in Matthew 14, you find it in Mark 6, and Luke 6, and John 6. Find a chapter 6 in the Gospels. You'll find it there. Mark chapter 1, verse 35 says, Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he, Jesus, went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. We find that habit of his. In our society today, getting a break often depends upon knowing the right person, right? Isn't that true? What is it that people say? What's the expression? It's who you know. Isn't that true? It's who you know. You get the job, or you may even get an opportunity to interview for the job if you know the right person. You don't know the right person, good luck to you. You're accepted into the university program if you know the right person. If you know the right person, you get a position on the team. If you know the right person, you're accepted into the club. If you know the right person, you get a part in the play. Getting elected depends a whole lot upon knowing a bunch of the right people, right? It's how things work in our world. Well, today I want to tell you that it's the same thing for Christians. It's true for Christians. It is who you know. That is, it is who you know if it's God you know. It's who you know if it's God you know. Because when it comes to serving God according to his will for your life, it all comes down really to knowing the right person. It is who you know if it's God that you know. You see, every Christian is called to be a disciple of Christ, is called to be a minister for him. That's what we're trying to talk about in our DOT Sabbaths. You should come some afternoon and find out. Trying to build up that mindset within us. But being effective in our ministry for him is dependent upon really knowing him. How can we serve a God that we're not too sure about? Paul is saying here in Galatians 1:16 and 17 that when God called him, he could have headed off to Jerusalem to consult with the church leaders, the Christian apostles and leaders there, but instead he did something unexpected. He headed off for the wilderness of Arabia. It seems like Paul realized that if he wanted to really fulfill God's purpose for his life, the most important person that he needed to meet, that he needed to spend time with, was Jesus, was God. Paul knew that ultimately it's who you know if it's God you know. So what can we take from this? What can we take from this record that Paul left Damascus to spend some time alone in the deserts of Arabia? I mean, is there a point? Is there a message? Is there a lesson in this for us today? There has to be, or else what happens to the sermon? There has to be, right? Of course there is. I would like for you to consider 2 points. Isn't that novel? Not 3, but 2 points that I believe we can draw from Paul's experience in Arabia. And I'd like to draw your attention to those points by simply asking you 2 questions. Short questions, simple but profound questions. And the first question I'll ask you is this. My question to you and me is, where is your Arabia? Where is your Arabia? And maybe that question should also include, when is your Arabia? You see, for all of the training and experience and knowledge that Paul had, he was a smart guy, well-educated, very capable, right? This guy could do stuff. But he still needed that time alone with God in the seclusion of the Arabian wilderness. And I think Paul's experience reminds us that quiet time alone with God is important. If it's really true that it's who you know, if it's God that you know, if that's really true, then when and where do you get to know God? When is it for you? When do you find that time to get away and pray and study and try to better understand how He wants you to serve Him? Where's that place for you? When is that place for you? You know, I can think of a few different pastors, men who some I've heard, some I've read of, who are considered to be very great preachers, who I've heard tell or I've read tell of how they go away and intentionally take anywhere from a week to 2 weeks. I've even heard up to 2 months a year just to be alone with God and pray and contemplate and plan their ministry. They're not at the church office. They're not available. They're gone to think and pray and connect with God. Now, you very well may not be called to the type of groundbreaking, far-reaching ministry and mission that Paul was called to. I mean, think about his deal, right? Go take the gospel message to the whole Gentile world. That's a pretty big deal. I don't think I've ever been called to do that. Maybe you haven't. It was a big thing. And the reality of our lives is you probably won't need to, or much less be able to take a couple of months, maybe a couple of years off like Paul did in Arabia. But I have to wonder if his example doesn't call us to consider when we can take some time to set aside for getting to know God and His will for our lives. When can we do that? And you know what that means? Maybe it means getting away by yourself for a little while in nature. We live in an urban setting. There's still lots of nature around. Nature in my backyard, crawling, trying to find something to throw at a raccoon last night. There's nature around, but you can find it pretty quick. But you know, where can your Arabia be? You know, maybe it's at some spiritual retreat where you can just kind of focus. Maybe it's even in a seminar with a bunch of other people, but you're in a setting, in a different setting where you can just be thinking about what God is teaching you and what He's calling you to do. Maybe it's some sacred time that you set aside each day or each week or each month or even each year. Maybe it could be part of a special time with God on a Sabbath. If you're involved with what goes on at Willowdale, finding time on Sabbath is challenging, to put it frankly, but maybe it's a Sabbath time. Maybe it could just be a weekend away from the TV and your regular family responsibilities. Now, I read something yesterday. This is from the Family and Technology Report released in May 2011 by the Barna Group. And it said, very few adults or youth take substantial breaks from technology. Some of you could take a break right at this moment. 1/3 of parents and nearly 1/2 of their children say they never really intentionally take a break from their screens. This explains why kids can sit at a dinner table texting each other rather than carrying on a conversation. It also begs the question, do we control technology, or is technology controlling us? Where's your Arabia? When's your Arabia? You need to have a little, you know, your screens are probably saying, please, just a vacation. Did we just rest? I don't know. Maybe you just need a little fast, a little break. I don't know. What is it for you? I don't imagine it will be the same for every Christian. Chuck Swindoll, in his book, Growing Strong in the Seasons of Life, quotes these words that said, we will not become men of God without the presence of solitude. I thought that was pretty cool, the presence of solitude. And then he later writes, listen, if you and I really treasure quietness, we will have to make time for it. When you feed it only the leftovers from the schedule, it always goes hungry. I don't know about you, but that's true for me, man. It's hard to find time. I cannot find enough hours in the week, in the year, sometimes it feels like. Where is your Arabia? So if knowing God is really important, the first question is, where's your Arabia? And the second question I would challenge you to consider is this: where is your Damascus? Where is your Damascus? Excuse me. Look at Galatians 1:17 again, especially the last part. You know, this whole verse is surprising. The first part is surprising, the middle part is surprising, but the last part is also kind of surprising, unexpected. Galatians 1:17. Surprisingly enough, Paul said, "Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me." And then surprisingly he said, "But I went to Arabia." And then I think surprisingly he said, "and returned again to Damascus." Notice where Paul went to when his time with God in Arabia was finished. He went right back to where he was before, the city of Damascus. I think that's kind of interesting. Is that where he was born? Is that his hometown? Nope. Is that where he intended to live? No, he just went to round up some people so he can get them persecuted or killed. But he ended up living there unexpectedly. That's where he became a Christian, and that was his first church home. You see, time spent with God puts a proper perspective, I think, on our service for him. Spending time alone with God is not an end in itself. Oh, I had a lovely week, just me and God, and it was wonderful. That's great, but there's a purpose for that. The time that we spend with God should bring us back to serving God among people. That's what Christianity is about. That whole monk thing, go live off in a cave, don't talk to anybody for a decade, just be with God. That's not what God called us to. Maybe in heaven you can do that, but I don't know if you'll want to, but that's not how it works on earth. It's this time with God that should help prepare us and give us courage to face the ministry for which he has called us in the setting where we find ourselves. Paul, this guy was really good at getting ahead and being noticed, right? In fact, in Galatians 1:14, he tells about his former rising status within Judaism. If he had not been converted to Christianity, guaranteed he certainly would have become one of the most influential of Jewish leaders. And this guy was rocketing to the top of influence. And so after his dramatic conversion experience, and then especially after receiving all those divine revelations in Arabia, man, don't you think Paul could have been tempted to head on down to Jerusalem, the center of everything? Kind of like Oshawa. No, to head on down to Jerusalem, and get to know and get to be known by the leaders of the church, just spend a little time in Jerusalem. They would have heard about his story, could have printed it up in the early Christian Review. He could have become a highly desired camp meeting circuit speaker and go around telling his testimony, and he could probably give an afternoon seminar on divine revelations and heavenly visions, and he would probably be able to secure a position there at the church headquarters in Jerusalem. Can you imagine? We want to introduce to you Paul, our new global evangelism coordinator, straight from Judaism, former persecutor of the church. He's now going to lead us. Could have had that, right? That's the way I think Paul would have done it before, the old Paul. But he had decided to know God first. And I think that had given him a new focus and a better perspective on God's will for his ministry and his life. And so what does Paul do? He returns right back to his home church there in Damascus. And he stayed there. He stayed there until his life was threatened and he was forced to leave. And it's very interesting to follow on Paul's story, because I don't know about you, but you think about Paul and you think of him traveling all over the place, these missionary journeys, guy who had itchy feet, couldn't stay put, always going around, always on the move, always doing stuff. But if you look at the story of Paul, it's not really like that. It's very interesting. He went to Damascus. When he was forced to leave, he left. He went down to Jerusalem. He was only there for 15 days. Why? Because they were going to kill him. He was forced to leave. So the brethren in the church, to keep him safe, the church members sent him off to his home city of Tarsus. And what did he do? He stayed there. He just stayed there. He remained there working in that area for God until Barnabas came and asked him to come down and help at the church of Antioch. So he went down to Antioch, and what did he do? He stayed there. You should know the answer by now. He stayed there until the Holy Spirit directed that he and Barnabas set out on their first missionary journey. It seems to me, when I really look at the life of Paul, that he had learned to be content to serve God just where he was. Just where he was. And you know what? Frankly, sometimes it can be hard to serve God just where I am, just where you are. You know why? Because we know the history of all of the problems that exist. We know all the stuff that hasn't worked, all the bad stuff that has happened. And frankly, we know all of the people involved. And we know that some of them are a pain in all kinds of body parts. And they're just tedious to deal with, and we're done with them. And along with that, they know us, and they know all the mistakes that we've made. And they know all the problems, and we've got all of that history, and sometimes it's a hard place to serve God just where we are. Isn't it? Okay, you're all in paradise, but for the rest of us in the world, sometimes it's hard. It is paradise here at Willowdale, but it's still planet Earth. There's no good way out of that one. Paul returned from his time with God in Arabia to serve him in Damascus, and I think part of learning to know God is learning to accept the ministry and the setting that he has called us to. Knowing God helps put our service for him in a proper perspective. You know what, I can think of a couple of people. I could probably think of more, but fortunately not very many. But I can think of a couple of pastors I have met over the years. Some of them I haven't known very well, but I've listened to them a little bit. And it seemed to me that they were just entirely focused on simply getting to know the right church leaders, getting to know the right people, getting themselves known, getting their name out there so that they could obtain what they would consider to be a higher and better position. I've met a couple people like that, and it's sad. And I realize that God calls people to important positions of leadership, and I'm not talking about that. God be praised that he gifts and calls people to that. But I have met some people, met some colleagues, and it's not true of most of my colleagues, but listening to these men, the focus seemed to be mostly on their life was about a relentless pursuit of the quest of achieving what they considered to be the top. You know, and they needed to write a book, so if they could just write a book and get it published, and if they could just somehow get on the camp meeting speaker circuit, and if they could have a specialty or something, some kind of a seminar that they could do, and maybe write a book and a study guide to go with it, and if they could just go to the right conventions and have an opportunity to speak and get known by the right people, and maybe get a position at the North American Division or the General Conference. You know, if they could just make a few more contacts and build up that LinkedIn thing a little bit. And I've met a couple people like that, and it just leaves me sad. Leaves me sad. God help us. Because in all that they said, I heard nothing to indicate that they had any understanding that it's only who you know if it's God you know. That's who you got to know. And the rest takes care of itself. Because part of knowing God is understanding and, frankly, humbly accepting the service that he has called you to. So let me ask you this. Are you bogged down? Are you discouraged? Are you dissatisfied with your ministry right where you are? You know, maybe you've been faithfully serving in the same role for so long, and it's okay, but you're just same old people and the same old round of problems, and you're just kind of done with it. And I wonder if Paul's example of returning to Damascus could perhaps suggest to us that maybe some time alone with God would help us see our service in a new perspective. You know, perhaps that time of getting to know God would give us a renewed drive, a renewed enthusiasm, or maybe just simply the courage to face his call to ministry right where we are. It can happen to church members, it can happen to pastors. There's got to be a greener pasture somewhere. No. We are where we are for now. God has called us, and he has something he wants us to do, and sometimes we need some time with him so we have the perspective and courage to keep going. You know what, I think about Paul, man, he had to face all kinds of hassles and problems and personal insults from these Judaizers throughout his life. These guys were making up stuff about him, plotting to kill him. Can you imagine people always following you around? Oh, let's try to kill him. I mean, that's kind of stressful, I think. How did he deal with that? How did he not go crazy with all this chaotic insanity all around him? I think he was able to deal with that because he took the time to know God, and that meant that he was confident in knowing that he was doing God's will. So they could do what they want. They could do all this craziness. He had to flee for his life, but he knew he was serving God, and that gave him the focus to just keep going. So does God need some time with you in Arabia so that you can serve him or continue to serve him in Damascus? I just want you to think about those questions. Where is your Arabia? And where is your Damascus? Because when it comes to being an effective and useful servant of God, that's an important thing to think about, because it's only who you know if it's God you know. I invite you to stand with me, and we're going to sing a quiet song. There is a quiet place, number 503.